Welcome back. In this video, we're going to make some tweaks to the ability Light Grenade that we built in the last video. And if you remember from the last video, I ended saying that, hey, we had an error and I'd look into it and we'd come back to it. Actually, it wasn't an error. It was actually working perfectly. It probably just because it was late at night, I was blind and couldn't tell it was working properly. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. So I've loaded back up the project, and you'll see because we modified the startup map, it brought us to the right place, which is good. I'm going to load these up because I don't like it's weird just staring at the sky there. So they'll actually load when you hit play, even if they're not loaded here, but I like to see what we're working with. Okay, so let's go take a look at what we thought was broken. And so what I'm going to do here to make it just a little bit easier to see this hit effect, and I'll point out that the reason we use this notify actor and not the static or the hit impact is that the hit impact was able to work for the first explosion on the ground, and it's because it was a one-shot. You start it playing and it just plays and finishes. What happens here, and the reason we needed this notify actor, is because we need to do this spawn emitter attached. Because we want this effect that plays on the character, not at the location the character was, but on the character, to move along with the character. And if we had just used the hit impact, what you would see is that if the character was running, they would run out of the effect, and that's not what we want. So this was the one we thought wasn't working, this Angel Dissolve. It actually was working fine. It just does a little hard to see. So just to make it super easy for us to see, I'm going to bump the scale up to 2. And we'll go here and take a look at it. Maybe if we go full screen here, it'll be a little bit easier to see too. So I haven't made any other changes since last night. See those blue things that are playing around them? That's not part of the effect that's hitting the ground. See, it's an extra effect that's playing on them. So there wasn't anything wrong. We just probably couldn't see it. So okay, let's see what we want to do here. So there's a couple things I want to tweak from playing around with it. So you'll notice there's these black. See them there? These black cards are floating above it, and it looks really bad. Well, it's because apparently in the original there was a feather that was, showing up. Probably go with the whole feather angel wings thing. I'm not sure, but it's missing, and so it now just plays this black card because it can't load the image. And so let's go in here under effects. And let's see, it had smoke in the name. It was this Angel Ascend Hit Smoke 2. And if we scroll over here, see these feathers, they didn't load. So we're just going to turn them off. Now when it plays here, oh, appears like something else isn't loading either. Something else black. Oh, maybe we have to hit save. Yeah, there's some other kind of black thing. What would it be here? Strands, droplets, mist. Sometimes it's hard to figure out which ones are doing rocks. Are these the rocks? Yeah. I guess those were rocks. Interesting. Anyway, we'll save that with those off. And probably look a little bit better. That black was kind of weird. There we go. Simplified the effect a little bit. Okay, another change that I didn't like here. Her arm moves so fast. It just, I don't know, the timing seems off. So let's go back to our light grenade. clear out the smoke filter. And let's change this rate here to 1. But one of the things that I had mentioned before is that try to make things reusable. So we're going to go through here. We're going to start creating um, some variables to help us control this stuff, and then we'll expose them, and we'll make a copy and show how we can reuse it. So casting anim rate. Start the default at, actually I'm going to start the default at 2 because I think that looks better for this one. Okay, so we've got that. We'd already done the AoE radius. We're going to expose these. Same with our projectiles. That one's an internal one. Okay, let's see what else we've got here. Let's go through this. So we've got this event activatability. And there's something else that I didn't talk about that I did want to, is that there's this function we can override called can activatability. And so you can basically check some things to see whether we should activate it or not before, basically a condition for activation. And sometimes what we'll do for certain things is we'll grab the actor info, and we'll get the owner actor. We'll cast to character. Convert this to a pure cast. And we will get movement component. And there's one called is moving on ground. And so we could say branch. Copy this. So this is going to say whether we can activate it. So if we're moving on the ground, yes. If we're in the air, we can't. And so now if we try that, we're on the ground. We can activate it. Oh, I changed it to 2, and I really wanted to make it 0.5. Now it's moving even twice as fast. But if we're in the air, so I'm spamming the E key while I'm in the air. Nothing's happening. So if we don't want to be able to throw in the air, we can do that. So you can create whatever kind of rules you want to create here in can activatability, and I got to that by overriding. Okay, let's go back to this. 0.5 looks a whole lot better. That's half. So if we go take a look at that, it just feels like it makes it seem like it has more weight. So it's basically playing it at half speed. I think it looks better. Okay, so we're back to the gameplay ability. So this is almost always what you do at the start, because you almost always need a reference to your owning player character. So we'll do that. We're committing the ability. So this is, remember there was this cost and this cooldown? Well, this commit ability basically commits those, the cost and the cooldown. So it's the point at which it charges you. You can, another thing you can do here, sometimes you need to split these. And you need to have the cooldown and the cost committed at different times. And the way that this can sometimes be useful is sometimes, like if you have a cast bar or something, and you might have different rules about, okay, if the cast is interrupted, does it still cost the mana, or does it not cost the mana? And so you may need to do them at separate times of the cooldown. So if you need to split them, you can apply the, you can commit the cooldown separate from the cost. This commit ability does both. See, it says here, attempts to commit the ability spend the resources. It means cooldown and cost. This is our last chance to fail. Okay, this is the part that's probably the most confusing, and it's why did we have 2 projectiles? Why do we need 2? Why can't we just use 1? And the reason is because we wanted this to be client predictive, meaning even if there was lag, we wanted the owning client to think there wasn't any lag. So normally when you build a multiplayer ability in UE4, and a lot of people do this, they build their ability and they think everything's great because it works in the editor. And then they go and try it on the internet and find out, you know what, it doesn't work on the internet because the internet has lag, whereas the editor basically runs under a zero lag environment. And what will end up happening is that under lag, you will hit your key here, the E key for me, to start that throwing arm and start the 0.2 of a second delay here before the actor spawns. But when you run it on the internet, you press the key and nothing happens. And the reason nothing happens is that because normally when you build RPC type abilities, you call the server and you ask the server, hey, can I do this? Because you want it to be server authoritative. You don't want to rely on the client. And so it takes that round trip from asking the server if you can do it, coming back to the client to have the client finally start swinging their arm. But in an action game, this just isn't nice, right? We don't want to press the E key and go, is it going to happen? Is it going to happen? You might remember when I remember raiding in WoW, and when new content would launch on Tuesday and everybody was hitting the server, you'd go and you'd try to run these raids and everybody'd be sitting there activating their abilities and you're like, did it go off yet? Did it go off? And because sometimes it'd be like 2-3 seconds of delay before your ability went off, if it ever did. And so we don't want that here. This is an action game. We need it to look like it's happening right away. And you might ask, well then, why do we need the gameplay abilities? Why don't I just have the client start that swing motion right away on the client, regardless of whether, without asking the server, right? Why don't we just start it happening right away? And we could do that, and some people have, but let me tell you what will happen. That works as long as the server comes back and said, yeah, you could do that. You had enough mana. You had enough mana. You were good. But what happens in reality is that sometimes, because of the timing difference, the client thinks it has enough mana and the server doesn't, and the server needs to win. And so what the gameplay ability system is going to do for us here is it is going to, if it was rejected, it's going to roll back everything that happened automatically. Now you could potentially build a system to do that yourself, but it's a lot of work. There's a lot of code in the gameplay abilities, and so we're gonna rely on it to do the rollback for us in the case that the server said, hey, no, you didn't really have enough mana, so we need to undo what you did. So what we've done here is we have a non-replicated and a replicated projectile. The non-replicated is basically just this dummy projectile that we're going to spawn on the client so that it looks like we're doing something, right? So that we don't see this arm start swinging and then no projectile comes out until the replicated projectile gets replicated back through actor replication. We don't want that. We need this dummy one so it looks like we're actually throwing something. And so that's what this non-replicated projectile is. It's just the dummy that plays on the owning client. And the replicated projectile is the real one. And this plays on the server, and also through actor replication gets replicated back to the proxy clients. In this case, because we're not using C++, it is also actually getting replicated back to the owning client. But if you remember, we looked for that condition and hit it. It's a bit of a hack. Later, we might take a look at the right way to do that. But that's the reason that we have two projectiles there. And let me show you what that actually does. So let's go here, and I recommend doing this for all your abilities. Set it to 2 players. We're going to test it as if it was on the internet. Okay, so let's switch here. I need to set up this character so we can get a good view of the action. That should be good. And now we're going to grab this one. Okay, and this is what you want to do to test all your abilities. So we're hitting the tilde key to bring up the console. We're typing net packet pkt lag equals, and I do 500. This is going to basically be half a second of lag. Okay, and we're activating that. And let me move this to where we can get a good view. And get into range here. Okay, so what we're looking for here is that this, in the bottom right corner here, this is the owning client. The main window over here to the top left is the proxy client. The owning client is actually going to, everything's going to happen right away because it's client predictive. But the proxy client and the server are not going to see that for half a second. And so I'm going to hit the key and be watching that the bottom right happens before. Do you see that? So do you see how there's a delay? Move so I can hit both of them. That's what's actually happening. This is what's going to happen on the internet, is that your owning client is actually doing things, whatever your lag, your round trip time, ahead of the server and the proxy clients. And so this is the core of gameplay abilities. This is why we use it. We want it to handle this client prediction for us. And so what you're seeing is that on the owning client, we're actually spawning the non-replicated. That's the one you see flying through the air. But on the, sometimes to show this, I'll actually make the projectile a different color so it's easy to see. And then the color of the projectile on the proxy client will actually be a completely different color than the one on the owning client, so that it's easy to see the effect. But that's what's happening behind the scenes. Change this back to 1. I always recommend testing with 2 players, because sometimes what will happen, I actually had this happen last night, is that everything works great on the owning client, and you go on the proxy client, and you're like, oh, the animation didn't play, or oh, it didn't, it just didn't work the right way. So you gotta test to make sure that it works on the owning client and the proxy client. Okay, so that's what's happening there. This wait delay was just so that it didn't, at the start of this, it would have looked weird if, as Seraph is twisting backwards for the throw, if while she's twisting backwards, the grenade's going forward, right? That just wouldn't make any sense. So about 0.2 is working here. You could potentially, if you wanted to, if you really wanted fine control, you could go into the animation, create an animation, notify, add another gameplay event, and have that come back. Wait for that apex, of where you wanted the throw to come from. We could totally do that and add another gameplay event. In this case, and that would be something you'd have to do if somehow there was a variable element of that. It wasn't always the same. But in this case, it's always playing the same animation. So we can just simplify it because it'll always be the same delay. You can play around with tweaking that. Okay, we're spawning the actor. And so this is what was pulling 1 on the server. So replicated on the server, non-replicated on the owning client. And we used the right-hand socket location. We added a small offset forward. So this get actor forward vector gets us a normalized 1 centimeter vector pointing forward. And we said, hey, times it by 50, so make it a 50 centimeter vector, so half a meter, and start it out in front of us. Okay, this is where we wait for the gameplay event for the grenade to hit. So either it hits or it despawns, right? So potentially if it runs the 4 seconds without hitting anything, I don't know if that's technically possible where we are right now, but if we were up on a tall mountain and we threw it off, at some point it would, at 4 seconds, it would despawn and it would hit this one and end the ability and clean things up. Want to make sure we always hit this end ability and clean things up. Otherwise, if the ability doesn't end, you won't be able to reactivate it. Remember that we did switch this to instance per actor. So there's actually only 1 of these gameplay abilities running at once. If this was a, high speed throwing, like we're just sitting there like chucking these things out and multiple need to be in the air at the same time, then we would need to do this instanced by per execution. Which potentially we may actually have to do because we had a 4 seconds and I don't think this cooldown is blocking us for 4 seconds. So um, let's take a look at that sometime. But yeah, so this instance per actor means there's just one for your actor and it keeps reusing it. And then this instance per execution means it spawns a new gameplay ability per time that you execute it. So most often I run instance per actor because you can't, like a melee swing, you can't do 2 of the same melee swing at once. Okay, so remember that our hit event sent the location of the hit in this target data. We pull out the origin. We use this little transform to make a gameplay ability targeting location info, and we plug it into this one. So this is an interesting one here, this RPG wait target data. So you'll notice that all the other ones say just wait, and this one says RPG. So this is a modified one that I modified. There were some things that it was doing that I didn't like. Particularly, it had a problem on dedicated servers of determining if it was the local owning player or not. And it was confused, and what happened is that it was running the local code twice and was skipping the server code, and therefore was never sending back that it was finished. And so I've made a few changes here, I believe, around the is locally controlled, which seems to be the problem that I always run into with anything gameplay ability related. Once you turn on dedicated server, the is locally controlled stops working. And I think I also may have added, yeah, so I've also added another kind of targeting actor here. Maybe we'll use that in a future video. And I think if I switch to user confirmed, I've added some additional aiming options as well, but I don't think we're using anything special in this one. Instant is pretty, so instant really just means it's doing things like radius, single line trace, ground trace. The user confirmed is basically a system where it goes back to the client and says, okay, I'm going to let you pick targets somehow. And you can create custom classes here for how you do that. This one here was basically a way where I've got like this sphere, right? So remember how sometimes in like World of Warcraft you'd go to cast a spell and it would put some kind of decal or something on the ground or some kind of targeting object, and you'd have to move it around with your mouse. And so that's kind of what I created here. So and then user confirmed would be required because basically it doesn't get the target data instantly. It actually has to go back to the client and say, okay, tell me what targets. And so, but in this case, the instance is pretty simple. We're really just using it to do a sphere trace. We could replace this with a sphere trace, but we're going to use this target data because it's nice how it gets us back these actors here. So in this case, it's a radius. I think we set it to 300. And this here is going to return an array of all of the ones hit. We loop through and apply the gameplay effect to each one of them, and then when it's completed, we end the ability. So that's how that's working here. And I wanted to go and take a look at now this the damage effect, because last night we just went and did this 8 damage, which is kind of stupid because this is an MMO. We need things to be based off stats. So instead, what we're going to do here is we're going to go attribute based. So we got these 4 options here. And I do have a video that goes into all of this in more detail. It's called Intro to Gameplay Abilities. I think Intro to Gameplay Abilities in UE4, something like that. You can find it on my channel, or you can search for it, and it'll go through a lot of this in more depth. But we've got the scalable float, and the reason they call it scalable is that it lets you connect to a curve here. And if you remember over here, this is very MOBA focused, but I guess it could work for MMOs too. There was this gameplay effect level, and so you can basically send in, this level, and if you're using scalable float and you can import these curves from an Excel spreadsheet. I think it's a CSV file import, and you can basically say, okay, if it's level 1, this much, if it's level 2, this much, level 3, this much. That's what that scalable float is. But we're going to go to attribute based, and we need a backing attribute. And so in this case, I think we're going to use our intellect. So we've got this OWS set intellect, and I want to bring over the management console here so we can take a look at how that connects. We're going to go into characters, and we're using test for demo. We're going to go into edit, and you see here that our intellect is 10. Okay? So we're going to scale off of that value. So what we can do here is we have intellect being our source, and then you can see here that we have this coefficient, pre-multiply additive, and post-multiply additive. And for our math people, what that basically looks like is we've got a x plus b, let's see, yeah, plus c. So in this case, x is our intellect, a is our coefficient, b is our pre-multiply additive, meaning it's inside the parentheses, and c is our post-multiply additive. So you can get some pretty powerful stuff just by using these numbers here. And what we're just going to say, so this will end up doing 15. Let's do 1.5 times intellect. Okay, so we've got it set to 10 right now, and so we should be doing 15 damage. We may also want it to always do at least 1, right? So a lot of times I'll do 1 on this post-multiply additive, so that even if our intellect is 0, and it does 0 times 1.5 and gets 0, it'll still add 1. So this is now going to do 16, because it's going to add that extra 1 at the end of it outside of the multiply. So let's try that out and see if we're doing a little more damage. Yeah, it seems like we are. Now let's go see if we can scale this up. So we're going to come here and we're going to change our intellect just so it's easy to see. We're going to change it to 50. Oops. See if that's saved. It did. Okay. So let's make sure it's pulling that in. So we should do some massive damage now. Look at that. So we should have done 75 plus 1, 76 damage. So we're just owning them. Let me go back and change it back to 10. So now we've got it connected to our stats system here, which is great because these stats are persistent. If you want to change your default stats for new characters created, that's over in this classes. Right now, Male Warrior is the only one. You can create as many classes as you want here. And if you go look at the character creation code in OWS and Blueprints, you get to send in that name. So you can easily create a character selection screen. You can modify to do that. And these are the defaults that it's going to pull in. So, okay. So we now have it running off of our attribute, which is great for an MMO. One of the other things we could have done is we could have done a custom calculation class, or we could have done set by caller. So set by caller lets us, I use it a lot, it lets the gameplay ability decide the damage to send in. Sometimes the gameplay ability might pull information from the character that's not one of these stats. So these stats are the only ones that are available. I've programmed these in the C++ and the OWS plugin. These are the only ones that are available for you to use inside the gameplay ability system. But sometimes you might have something that's in the character, or something that's telling you, or you did some kind of calculation, potentially we could have done here. So the AoE could potentially have done more damage at the center of the radius and less damage toward the edges. In which case, what we would have done is used a set by caller to send that over, so that we could dynamically calculate that damage. But I think right now we're going to stick with 1.5 times intellect plus 1 for our damage. We can add other modifiers here if it did things other than damage. Damage is actually a special type. Damage and healing. These are transient values. They don't stay. They just get used to apply to hit points, and you will notice that health is not in this list, and there's a reason for that. We basically want to make sure that everything goes through these transient damage and healing so that it can go through our damage and healing pipelines and finally get applied to the final health. So we don't ever want to actually modify health on its own. So I added a special tag that makes sure that it does not show up in this list. Okay, so we've now modified our damage so that it is based on our intellect. There's some other fun things here too that are kind of built in. You can have a chance to apply to target. So if we wanted it so that there was only a 90% chance they got damaged, we could do that here. If you want it to only apply to certain people, like, oh, you know what, this only did damage to people who already had this other damage over time or status effect on them. You can have some application requirements. This is where we did our cues. So we could potentially here, we've got this AoE hit. We could have had like a small hit and a large hit, and then we could have come here on this damage, pick damage, and said, oh, if the damage was between 0 and 10, do the small hit Q. If it was more than 10, do the large hit Q. So that's kind of cool to be able to do that. And then this is one that's used really common here. Often you want to, especially if this was an instant, but if you do a infinite or has duration, because you're doing some kind of status effect, you usually want to apply tags, this granted tags, to the target to say that they have that status effect so you can have other things go off of those. So let's say that this AoE didn't do damage, and instead it needed to apply, let's say it did a poison, okay? So it did a poison over time. We could go here and change this to has duration. We could set up a damage, right, of a much smaller amount, and we could set it to tick. So if we come down to, let's see, there's a spot here where we can have the damage tick. Overflow, application, display, tags. Oh, you know what? I bet we actually have to switch it to get it. Has duration. Yeah, period. So we could say tick every 1 second. And then this one decides whether there's a tick at the start of the first second or wait until the end of the second if it's unchecked. So when we would do that, we would obviously want to keep track of whether they were poisoned or not. So we could have a combat.poisoned added here. There are a ton of things you can do. They definitely tried to make this system flexible enough that it's nearly impossible to find something you can't do. You pretty much can do anything you want. It's really flexible. Okay, let's see what we've got here. So we've got our character. We've got it doing damage based on the intellect, which is great. We doubled the size of those dissolve effects on them, so now they're easier to see. And we removed those feathers and rocks that were creating a weird look. Okay, so I think that's where we're going to end for this video. but I just wanted to show you cleaning up a few of those things and going into the ability a little bit more in depth. So until next time, see ya.